Hello and welcome to another submarine chat. On February the 8th this year, a video emerged on Chinese social media showing a submarine. That's reasonably interesting, unusual, but what's particularly interesting is that the type of submarine it showed didn't match any that have been previously seen. It's a new class of submarine. And of course, this is open source intelligence. We don't know the name of this submarine. This chat is going to be about what we do know about it and trying to figure out how big it is and what it might be capable of, and more interestingly, why China might have built it. It's distinctly different than any submarine that's in service in the West. It's a different category of submarine. The video shows a submarine on a river. It's pretty hard to guess where, but you can see there's some blue tents on the back of the submarine. I think that they're over access hatches. This submarine looks like it's still being fitted out and is being moved down a river between shipyards. Essentially, it's not yet a service submarine. It's that scaffolding and things like that on the back of it. Okay, like my other videos, this is unscripted. You can probably tell that already. Also, I don't have a good mic, but I'm not going to apologize for that. You came for the content, not the audio. So let's get on with it. Firstly, we don't know the name, but I think a good nickname is the Olympics class because it's emerged during the Beijing Olympics. Pretty easy to put it in time and place. That's useful. When you don't know the name of submarine, you still have to refer to it. And we have nicknames of various submarines. If we're honest, there are some submarines that are in service with the Chinese Navy that we still don't know the official designation of. China is in no hurry to tell Western observers what different submarines are. We may never know or not know for many years what this submarine is called. Of course, I put this video out, we might know tomorrow. There might be an official announcement. You never know. Olympics class, someone coined it, not me. I think it's great. I said it's hard to guess where it was. Actually, not so hard. I've geolocated it with about 80% confidence, not 100%, but 80%, say, to an area on the Yangtze River. This is quite useful because we can start to guess where it was built and where it's going. So the Yangtze River in the area in question is between the cities of Wuhan and Shanghai. Wuhan, you've heard of that for coronavirus, of course. It's that city. And Shanghai down on the coast, major financial center, but also a major area for shipbuilding. And there are some shipyards in Wuhan that build submarines. They build non-nuclear submarines. That's useful information itself. And they're owned by a certain shipbuilder. The first one, just in downtown Wuhan, is the older one. This is what we just termed Wuhan Shipyard. And this shipyard traditionally built a lot of submarines, but more in recent years, it appeared to almost close down. It still builds some submarines, though. There's actually another one that we don't know the name of, and you can see it through the railings of this photograph, which is taken from the bridge. You can see it sort of bottom left of the satellite image. So it builds a very low rate of submarines, but the submarines it does build circumstantially seem to be unusual submarines, perhaps first in class, that sort of thing. So this is a really good contender for this new submarine, although we have not observed it there. And even though it's downtown, even though it's overlooked by a lot of people every day, you don't get very many photographs of it at all servicing on Chinese social media. People in general don't advertise what China's building. The other shipyard is out of town. It's much more modern, much newer, much bigger, and they're building non-nuclear submarines there in series production, not just for the Chinese Navy, but also for the Thai Navy and I think the Pakistan Navy as well. So that's A and B on this map. At the other end, at the Shanghai end, you also have two more shipyards. All these shipyards are owned by the same company, CSIC. Let's look at the submarine, though. It's just a video. I'm not going to share the actual video. It was taken down from Chinese social media soon after it gained attention in the West. But obviously, there's some stills here. Firstly, I think that it is a single hull submarine. This is actually quite significant. Just quickly, there are two ways of building submarines. If you cut them in half from looking front to back, you would see a cylindrical pressure hull. That's the circles in the middle, A and B. One way to do it is to put an outer hull all the way around, and that's called double hull construction. That is normal for Chinese submarines and Russian ones as well. Single hull construction, you have the minimal amount of casing maybe on top, but you don't have an extra hull going all the way around. That's how typically in the West we build submarines, the US, UK currently. I could do a whole video on single and double hull. There's lots of debates about it. I think this submarine actually is single hull based on the lines and what we can see. Not certain, again, 80%. That's significant because China doesn't normally build single hull designs. This is quite different in Chinese terms. It's very different from the other submarines they're building. You can also see some white lines on the video. These are actually markings used for measuring the depth of the submarines in the water to the trim of submarine. And they're very important for safety, obviously. Chinese submarines, they work like this. This is a different submarine, but it's really clear photograph. It's different from Western navies, particularly US Navy, Royal Navy. They're measured from the waterline up or down, and they're in 1 meter increments. So if you can see the larger dashes, that's at the 1 meter interval, you could use that to measure the submarine and work out the hull diameter, which is what I did, of course. So here is the 1 meter measure, and we can estimate very approximately using pixels in MS Paint actually, but using pixels sort of approach, you can estimate the size of the submarine. And the two circles are different potential pressure hull diameters. I chose very specific numbers, 3.6 and 4.6 meters. That will become obvious on the next slide why. I think the 4.6, that's the larger of those two white circles, is a better match for the submarine in terms of balance and what we can see above the waterline. The other one just looks too small. It would be a super skinny submarine. I don't think it's that. The reason I chose those numbers is because CSIC, the company that owns those shipyards, had previously, in I think 2017, going by memory, about that time, they had shown off several small submarine designs for export in Thailand, actually, but just general export proposals. One was called the MS-200. That is a 200-ton, what we term a midget submarine. Actually, 200 tons is slightly larger than most midget submarines. You could debate whether it should be one category higher, but in their terms, it's a midget submarine. In modern terms, it's a midget submarine. S-600 is what we term a coastal submarine, or very small submarine, really, but bigger than a midget submarine, 600 tons. And then there was the S-1100, which is kind of hard to classify. It's a normal full-size submarine, but it's really at the bottom end in terms of displacement for modern non-nuclear submarines. It's a smallish submarine, unofficially, let's say. The hull diameter is different. 3.6 for the midget submarine, 4.6 for the S-600, and 5.6 for the S-1100. I don't think it's the S-1100. I think it's too small to be that. I think the best match is actually about the S-600 size. That's interesting because the MS-200 visually is a closer match, but I don't think it's that. I think it's closer to the S-600, but with some features, so a mix of two. So the other submarine we need to mention, go back to the photograph I used before, is a Sailless submarine. This was, I think, an experimental submarine that was built in Shanghai, again at a CSIC shipyard, but not the same shipyard where I think the new submarine was built. It is single hull, I believe, which is significant because it's a connection, as are those previous export designs, should say. You can tell why we call it Sailless submarine. We don't know the designation of it. For years we have not known the designation of this, but call it Sailless submarine because it doesn't have a sail. It's the only submarine in the world that doesn't have a sail. Other navies, US Navy, Russian Navy in particular have really seriously considered getting rid of the sail on a submarine. There's some reasons to do that, but they haven't. China has built one, but it's quite a small submarine. It's actually really close in size to what I think we're looking at now. This is a good visual representation of the difference in size of the new submarine versus a normal submarine, let's say. These are not Chinese, they're German, but it's a brilliant photograph. The one on the left is your normal size Type 212A. That's got 2 deck levels in it. So 3 levels overall, because you can have stuff underneath the bottom. It's pretty normal. In fact, it's still much, much smaller than a nuclear submarine. The one on the right is no longer in service. It's a sort of old design, but it's the Type 206A. That's about the same size as what we're looking at, and you can really see the difference. Nuclear submarines are about 10 times the size of this new submarine if it's a 600-ton boat. So it's going to be much, much smaller than anything else in regular Chinese Navy service. Why is China building that? Interesting point. One idea might be that they're not building it for their own use, they're building it for export. After all, the designs that we're comparing it with, the CSIC designs, are all export models. At least that was how they're presented in Shanghai. In Bangkok. Closest to camera here is the midget submarine, and you can see visually it looks very similar, but the sail is much further back and so on. So it's not identical. I think it's closer to the one behind it, which is the S600. But I don't think it is for export. One hint are the white lines along the top of the sail. There's actually 3 of them on Chinese submarines, although only 2 are easily visible from the side. The third one is running right along the edge of the top of the sail. They tend to put these on submarines before they are commissioned, particularly new submarines, new types. Don't really know what they're for, but it's a habit, and it's before they're commissioned into the Chinese Navy. There was no fanfare, there was no advertising a submarine, and it's got those white lines. So while I can't rule out that it's an export submarine, I think it's less likely. This seems to be a Chinese Navy submarine. That is actually way more interesting, because we have the natural question, why does China want to have small coastal submarines when no one else wants to have them? Coastal submarines are not as good as regular submarines. The fact that they're smaller limits their performance, their endurance, their fightability, how many weapons they've got, and so on. In fact, there are 4 general roles you can give such a small submarine. The first one is just an experimental submarine. It's obviously cheaper to experiment with a smaller hull than a larger one. I think that's what the Sailless Submarine is about, primarily, but it's an expensive game building submarines, and even small ones. So it would seem wasteful. And the real question is, what would they be experimenting with? What technology would they have on that submarine that they couldn't have put on the Sailless Submarine or a larger, older submarine? Take an old submarine and refit it. So it's not clear to me that it's an experimental submarine. Another role that's often advertised is as a training submarine, to train your own forces in how to fight enemy submarines. That's because it's expensive to use your regular submarines for that purpose, so you build a cheaper, more basic submarine. China did do this in the past with some midget submarines, but I don't think that was the original intention of those boats. It's just that they didn't prove very useful and they used them for that. However, it seems a waste to build a submarine that does that, especially one that looks quite polished like we're seeing. Additionally, China has an abundance of old submarines it could use. I don't think they have this problem. Another use is special forces or special operations type missions. This one's quite compelling. Often countries that do operate midget submarines do so for this reason. Smaller submarines can get much closer inshore. They might be more expendable in a sense. And so on. So you can put them in these high-risk special forces missions. It might be for that. Another general thing is just littoral or really shallow water combat. Obviously, if you've got shallow seas, normal size submarines are going to find it harder to operate, harder to hide. China is surrounded by extremely shallow seas. They're not submarine friendly at all, really. The Yellow Sea, the water between China and Taiwan, and most of the South China Sea. But the South China Sea does have some deep pockets in it. That's why they put their ballistic missile submarines there. But in general, China is surrounded by seas which are not the best for regular submarines. And they might see an advantage in having such a small submarine there. So what are we looking at? Beneath the waterline, I think that the submarine looks pretty conventional based on what we know, what we can guess. It has a rounded bow and it has a single screw at the back. We estimate that it's approximately 4.6 meters, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less, but about that, and maybe about 40 to 50 meters long. I don't trust the length measurement in the same way. I wouldn't use pixels on the video because when videos are uploaded to social media, they're often distorted. The resolution changes to optimize for the platform, usually beyond the control of the author. So I'm not going to count pixels on length, but judge it to be between 40 and 50 meters. 50 meters being what was advertised for the 600-ton submarine. That means that it has space for a single deck within the submarine. You can have 2 levels because you can have batteries or fuel tanks and things like that underneath the deck, but it's still a really small submarine. Bear in mind that nuclear submarines often have 3 or 4 decks. They're much, much bigger hull diameter and you can fit much larger things in there. This will limit its armament. Based again on what we saw in Bangkok, it probably has between 2 and 4 torpedo tubes. It may have room for reloads, but probably not. So it's probably got a much smaller weapons load than a regular submarine. But it's still very dangerous to ships and things like that. The submarines, the export submarines were also advertised to have an air independent power, AIP. I did a whole video on that, but just quickly, AIP is something that allows submarines to operate underwater for much longer than if they were just relying on their batteries. I'm not really convinced that it has AIP because such a small submarine, although it was advertised on the export catalog to develop such a small AIP system, and you would only be able to carry a very small amount of liquid oxygen, which most AIP systems are going to require, whether it's a Stirling engine, which is the way China has done it in the past, fuel cells, we don't know, but China may have been experimenting with fuel cells. They certainly have the technology, broadly speaking, they could. But they need to store a lot of liquid oxygen and they're not really seeing that. So I've got some question marks there, but certainly it can't be ruled out. What I think is more interesting and possible is that it uses lithium-based batteries. This would be really cutting edge and actually might be one, I'd say, a speculation as to why China is building such small submarines. Lithium-based batteries are going to revolutionize submarines. They're much more energy dense. You get more power in there. So the most obvious thing is that you can go much longer underwater between recharging your batteries. This means that they could actually replace AIP in many cases, and that's what's happening in Japan. Japan is the first country to use lithium-based batteries on submarines. South Korea is also close to installing them on production submarines, and countries such as Italy are developing this technology as well. As well as being much longer endurance, you could potentially have higher cruising speeds because you have more energy. Obviously, you're trading speed and endurance, but you could cruise at higher speeds. That could be significant because one of the main limitations of submarines, especially really small submarines, is they tend to be really slow. That doesn't mean they're useless, but it means you can't deploy them where you want them as flexibly. Whereas this submarine, if it's got lithium batteries, could potentially transit from A to B much faster and get out of trouble much easier. It doesn't necessarily translate into higher top speeds because that is going to be restricted by the motor. And obviously a small submarine can't have as big a motor as a larger submarine and so on. But for whatever speed it can do within the sort of parameters of its hydrodynamics and the motor, it could potentially do it for longer because it's got much more battery to put there. So this could be really significant, and I think that would be enough to make very small submarines much more tempting than they were in the past. The reason we haven't seen lithium-based batteries more is because they are in general more dangerous. Now, before anyone writes this in the comments and starts discussing this is the view within the shipbuilding and the naval architecture community. The challenges are that batteries are anyway one of the dangerous parts on a submarine. Everything on a submarine is dangerous, but batteries are one of the things that can kill you. If this lead acid normal batteries, they can have a build-up of hydrogen, you can get explosions, fires, and so on. Although it's not really been proven, there are certainly some cases where it's suspected that contributed to the loss of a submarine. Lithium batteries may not individually be more likely to catch fire, although they might, but even if they were less likely to actually catch fire, once they do, the fire is much harder to stop and will spread much more to other batteries, and you get essentially a cook-off, and it'll be very hard to put the fire out. There are technologies, substances to put the fire out, but those tend to be very dangerous to human life. So your attempts to extinguish a fire might kill the people before the fire would have done. These are not insurmountable problems. There's much more to it. Clearly, Japan believes it's overcome that. Clearly, South Korea believes it's overcome that. Everyone else believes they will overcome that. So I think you will see lithium-based batteries in submarines, but it is the challenge. It's why it's not already there. And China, we don't know for sure that they've done it, but there is at least, this photograph is part of the story. There is the belief that China has been researching this and says it's put them on, or some people in China say that they've put them on certain submarines. If they have, that would be something I think that could be quite a game changer in submarine performance overall, and could make very small submarines, which traditionally have been unattractive to large navies who have China can build nuclear submarines. Why would they build a coastal submarine? They might actually become much more attractive now. So that's an interesting possibility. We're getting into speculation, but I think it could be months, if not years, before we really know the answers to any of this. Of course, equally, they might go and do a tell-all next week. Who knows? So thank you for listening. As I said, it was unscripted. I'm sure that's very obvious. If you like it, please share. Please let people know. It's not monetized, so it probably, you need some spreading the word. Thank you for listening. Thank you.